Genesis 15, Abraham is moaning to God. He's lamenting the lack of a male heir. Culturally, this lack was huge. Without a male heir, his name and his memory would not live on, and his possessions, including his wife and slave, would become the property of another. Previously, his God had promised Abraham progeny numerous as the stars in the sky and the sands in the sea. Yet now, chapters later, Abram still sees no evidence of this. The entire ancestral narrative from chapters 12 to 25 in Genesis is dominated by this question of an heir. Anxiety and doubt are frequently part of Abraham's conversation with God. Doubt and faith are not mutually exclusive, but woven together. So too are failure and faith. Maybe that's why this reading is set for the middle of Lent. To briefly summarize the succession saga in the chapters of Genesis, Abraham's wife Sarah is past childbearing age. She therefore suggests, as was common in the Near East, that Abraham have intercourse with her maid, the Egyptian slave girl Hagar. Hagar conceives and bears a son, Ishmael. Abraham is delighted. Sarah, however, is envious. Hagar, she moans to Abraham, is treating me with contempt. And Abraham tries to dodge the conflict. She's your slave. A number of years go by, and then, according to the story, God decides to favor Sarah, and she too conceives and bears a son. His name was Isaac. Sarah, however, was not content. She petitioned Abraham to cast out Hagar and his teenage son Ishmael into the desert, where they would surely perish. Abraham, though in grief at the situation, consults his God, who seems to agree with Sarah. The child of promise would be Isaac, not Ishmael. So Hagar and Ishmael are cast out, though later they are divinely rescued. God seems to flip-flop, wanting to put $1 each way, and saves them. Well, there are 4 interpretive keys or lenses that we need to read this story through to understand it. The first is ancient biology. The second is patriarchal power. The third is what is called texts of terror. And the fourth is the fragments of God we find in Genesis. In ancient times, sperm was considered to be seed, namely what we would call a fertilized egg. The woman's womb was merely a garden or an incubator for the seed. All the chromosomes were thought to come from the male. So any child a man fathered, regardless of the status of the mother, was 100% genuine offspring. Abraham's firstborn son and heir, therefore, was Ishmael, not Isaac. To follow the directions of his God and his wife Sarah, and to cast Ishmael out, was to visit upon his rightful heir a huge injustice. No theological gloss by later editors can disguise this fact. Further, this injustice around inheritance would be perpetuated into generations to come, causing huge distress and enmity. The second thing to understand is patriarchal power. Abraham and Sarah did not have one of those 21st century relationships of mutuality and equality. The patriarch ruled the clan. All slaves, all wives would belong to him. He had the power and the responsibility. So when Sarah moaned to him about Hagar's behavior, Abraham had the authority to mediate a just solution, which he failed to do. Hagar is punished, and Sarah's envy goes unbridled. Similarly, after Isaac is born, when Sarah outrageously requests him to not only elevate her son to be heir, but to cast out Ishmael into the desert, Abraham needs to use his patriarchal authority to mediate what is best and uphold what is right. Again, Abraham fails. He seems to emotionally freeze up and become incapable of exercising leadership. In a patriarchal world, it's not fair to blame Sarah for what happened to Ishmael and Hagar. It was not Sarah's decision. Her power compared with the patriarch was minimal. It was Abraham who failed. In casting out Ishmael, he grievously wounded his heart, and his heart never recovered. The phrase texts of terror was coined by Professor Phyllis Tribble to describe the stories in the Bible that were thoroughly bad news for women. Not only were the women in these stories, and she uses, for examples, victims of cruelty, but the text portrays God as either silent, absent, or assenting to the cruelty. In a similar way, Philip Culbertson has written about texts of terror for men, including this example of Abraham, who in response to the petitions of Sarah and the apparent will of God, abandons his firstborn son to a likely death. Abraham has argued with God before, arguing for compassion rather than punishment. Yet here, when his son's life is at stake, he loses his steely backbone and succumbs to the pressures upon him. Not everything in the Bible is written for the purpose of imitating or emulating. Not everything is in the mode, Abraham did that and so should we, or God said that and we should obey it. Some parts of the Bible are written as history, some poetry, some parables, visions, etc. And some parts of the Bible were written for us to recognize injustice, its origins, the connivance of the powerful, and the culpability of the God involved. These stories invite our participation in making sure they never happen again. To mistake a text of terror for a go and do likewise story is not only to misread the Bible, it's to repeat again the injustices of old. So what is God in the book of Genesis? Well, it can be friendly and benevolent, but also terrifying and cruel. The attributes of divinity seem unable to be held with integrity within one concept of God. Simply, God can't be loving and cruel, for the love would undermine the cruelty, and the cruelty would undermine the love. Hence, some authors talk about gods, plural, in Genesis, including those named Yahweh, Elohim, El Shaddai. Karen Armstrong talks about Genesis offering us glimpses of the divine which can only be fragmentary, imperfect, and colored by the culture's experience of life's inherent tragedy.